Hello, I'm Dr. Vint Blackburn, and if you're interested in reducing the stigma of mental health, as well as having a better understanding of psychiatry in general, then you're in the right place. Feeling unheard or having one's feelings invalidated, it can be really hard for people in emotional pain. But it's especially distressing for people with increased emotional sensitivity, such as those under duress or those suffering with illnesses such as borderline personality disorder. Without meaning to, we often say something that only seems to make the situation worse when we are actually just trying to help. This can be very distressing and confusing for everyone involved. And today, I'd like to talk to family members and others about better ways to offer support to someone who is emotionally struggling without inadvertently escalating the situation. It's not difficult, but it does require us to be much more mindful of what we mean to say and how we say it. Before I continue, I would really appreciate it if you would give this video the thumbs up, or if you find it helpful or interesting, please, please, please subscribe. I'm planning on making at least one video a week, and if you subscribe and push the bell, you'll be notified whenever I post a new one. Now, it's important to understand that we rarely truly know what it feels like to be suffering from illness, unless we're actually experiencing it ourselves. This is true of depression, of anxiety, and acutely so with people who suffer from illnesses like borderline personality disorder. We all have feelings and emotions, so we tend to equate our own reactions and experiences to those around us. But the fact of the matter is that not everyone feels things the same way or at the same level of intensity. One example that I find helpful is the burn analogy. If you poke a random person lightly, they might hardly notice. But if you poke someone with third-degree burns all over their body, they are going to hit the ceiling in excruciating agony. Many people struggle with intense sensitivity to their emotions, and where a random individual might shrug off anger or fear or a certain amount of guilt, some people experience these emotions very differently, much more intensely. One of the problems I often see, especially with partners, family members, parents of people who are in emotional distress, is that they often take one of two approaches, both of which can unfortunately serve to increase the emotions of their struggling loved one, not decrease them. The first approach involves trying to solve the problem. The second is the confusion between how to validate the person's feelings and not necessarily the behavior. Let's tackle the first one. Most people want to be helpful, especially parents and partners. I mean, when we see somebody we care about upset, hurting, angry, emotional, one of our first responses is to try and find a solution. We often do this long before the person is even ready to consider a solution. They're still just trying to process how they feel. And it's important to remember that a lot of times people just want others to understand what they're going through, that they're hurting, that they're suffering. Simply listening and validating can be one of the most powerful things you can do in these circumstances, especially when life and death aren't on the line, which is most of the time. It's not that finding a solution is a bad idea, just not at that moment. First, the individual needs to know that you understand how they're feeling. Instead, we jump right into offering solutions, and we get upset when those people seem to be rejecting this help. Other times we respond with statements like, "You're overreacting," when we're really just trying to point out that the situation may not be as bad as it seems. We often say something like, "It could be worse," or "You'll get over it," or "You shouldn't feel so bad." We often say these things with the best of intentions, but the message is often perceived as, "You really don't understand how much pain I'm in right now." There is no better way to ramp up someone else's emotions than to ignore or minimize them. Think of it this way. If you came across someone who is standing waist deep in boiling water, and they're doing their best to keep their composure while they describe to you how they are feeling, well, if your first response to them is, "Come on, it's not that bad," mostly because they're not screaming and writhing in pain, well, then there's a natural response on their part to increase the intensity of their expression so that you can better understand what they're really going through. But if instead you respond to somebody in a way that shows that you do understand that they're struggling, and whether you would be struggling in the same circumstances or not is completely irrelevant, by saying something like, "Wow, that seems like you must be in a lot of pain," well, then they feel heard, and often then are a lot more receptive to help. But it helps for them to know that you do understand first. When words and sometimes objects are flying, our first response is to say something like, "You're acting ridiculous," or "silly," or "reacting immaturely." And though we may be responding to the actions, we are unwittingly communicating that the feelings driving these behaviors are also ridiculous, silly, or immature. And that's simply not the case. The feelings are just that, feelings. And they need to be acknowledged if we hope to see the reaction diminish. One of the worst things you can do, and something we learn early on in de-escalating training, is never tell somebody who's dysregulated or upset, "Calm down," or "You're overreacting." If I could get people to remove any statements from their vocabulary, it would be those two. They never have the desired effect. But now we get to the second problem, which is how do we validate an intense emotion without feeling like we are somehow validating the behavior we're seeing? I distinctly remember this one case when I was working inpatient at a psychiatric hospital, and I had a medical student who was rounding with me. And this lady had just been brought into the unit on an involuntary hospitalization, in other words, against her will. And since being on the ward, she had been threatening, extremely irritable, throwing cups of water at staff, screaming epithets at everyone at the top of her lungs, and reacting quite explosively when nurses or other staff members would attempt to redirect her or calm her down. "Let's go and do our interview with her and see what's going on," I told him. And his first reaction was, "You mean out in the group area, right?" And I said, "No, in an interview room." "Just the two of us?" I'd been watching this lady for a while, and it was clear that she was extremely upset at being at the hospital against her will. And being told to calm down, to go over there, to sit down, wasn't helping matters. I asked her if she would be willing to come into an interview room, and at first she stood at the door and began yelling at us for taking her hostage, and she was making it perfectly clear that she was not interested in being there or working with us. I looked straight at her and I said, "You know, it sucks to be brought into a place against your will like this. I always wanted to be a doctor, not a jailer, and it really feels like a violation, and I don't blame you for being upset at all." Interestingly, it was as if the air had been let out of the balloon. She sat down in the chair and she said, "I know, right?" And then she was able to actually talk with us in order to help better understand her needs. Now, I was in no way happy with how she was reacting to the situation, throwing things, yelling, screaming, but I certainly felt that I understood and could name her frustration. I could validate her feelings. And that's all it actually took. The best part was when we left the interview room and the med student looked at me and said, "What just happened?" It is not easy to validate intense feelings, especially in the face of really strong reactive emotions. But doing so can be the first step in helping that person regain control. Keep that in mind next time you jump in and try to offer helpful solutions in the heat of the moment, or before you start minimizing those feelings. Now remember, if this is useful or helpful, I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe to my channel and like this video. I have more videos coming out all the time, and I'm open to suggestions or questions as well. So please leave a comment down below if you have any questions or thoughts. I'm really open to exploring anything that people are interested in relating to psychiatry or mental health. Now, I won't give individual advice. For that, you need to go see your own doctor. But any general question is certainly fair game. And remember, physical health and mental health, they're the same thing. See you next time.